Hello, my name is Susan Reddington Bobby, also known as ProfessorOfWords.com, and I am here to give you an introduction to my Guillermo del Toro film discussion classes. On my website, ProfessorOfWords.com, they are listed under the very bottom, if you scroll the whole way down the page, of all the different options that I can be hired for all the different services that I provide. You can see at the bottom right corner a lovely picture of the dark woods, and if you click on that, it will take you to the page that is titled Build Your Own Guillermo del Toro Class. So what that essentially means is that I've designed a series of classes. They meet approximately every 2 weeks on a Sunday afternoon, and they are classes in which we discuss films that were directed and written by Guillermo del Toro. So I'll read to you a description of these classes just so you can get a sense of what they're like. And there's also more information on my webpage about it. But the description reads, Build Your Own Guillermo del Toro Class is a series of classes designed for people who are interested in del Toro's films, in which each class examines in depth one work, one film. Discussion may center on several of the following elements: narrative, which would be like the plot, characters, imagery, symbols, color palette, music, dialogue, themes, adherence to or lack of adherence to a particular genre. As you know, he creates films in multiple genres, and we talk a bit about whether he adheres to the established sort of hallmarks of that genre, or whether he deliberately seems to stray or move away from them. We also look at the overall aesthetic of the films, and we do this in order to arrive at a deeper, more multi-layered understanding of the film. In addition, if it enhances the understanding of the films we discuss will be considered in relation to some of the others in his body of work. It is my contention that the ultimate experience can be attained if one examines all of his films. The iconic and celebrated writer and director maintains himself that all of his films are connected, that they all live in the same universe. So a richer understanding of his themes and his goals as a storyteller can be achieved by noting similarities and differences between the films. And as we noted, we've done one class so far on the first film he did, which was called Kronos. And the people who came to that class, a couple of them noticed that if they had seen films that he did later in life, they were able to look at Kronos, which they'd never seen before, and kind of see this moment of recognition where they would look at it and think, or they'd quickly raise their hand and say, okay, well, I've seen such and such a film, and I feel like he does this in this film, but is this the same thing? Like, did he come up with this idea all the way back with Kronos? And, and I usually would say, yes, he did. These things are intentional. His films are intertextual in that they can make references to one another, and they also will make references sometimes to allusions, literary allusions, references to other works outside of his own. But yes, his whole series of films, even though they are different genres most of the time, they intertwine with one another. So this is what the whole series is about. And you can take one class alone, or you can take multiple classes. If you wish to take a class, you just go to my website. In that section of the website, and if you drop down, you can see the syllabus for the whole next couple of months, and it gives the date and time for each one of the film discussion groups, and you can join wherever you want. There is a charge for each class. It is $30, and the classes are scheduled to meet for 90 minutes at least. The first class that I taught, we actually ended up going closer to 2 hours. I would cut it off absolutely at 2 hours. But somewhere in that range, at least 90 minutes up to 2 hours of discussion. And like I said, you can join any class that you want. What you need to do is to basically prepay for the class, and you can scroll down and you can click the PayPal, Venmo, credit card, and pay for that class. What I will tell you to do as well is that in the note section, when you go to make a payment, indicate in the note section which class or classes you want me to put you down as attending, because for each class I will need to send out a Zoom link to those who are registered. And I ask that people register no later than 2 hours before the class meeting time, just so that I can make sure that I have time to get the bookkeeping taken care of and get that Zoom link out to those who are going to be taking that class. When you come to the class, you just click on the link. It'll say that wait till the host lets you in. It has you going into a waiting room, and then as soon as I see you and I have you on my list as attending this class, I'll click and you'll be in the class. And you can participate as much or as little as you want. It's entirely up to you. I have a set of questions that I cover for each film, but that changes considerably based on the audience I have in front of me, because different audience members have different things that they want to bring up. And certainly sometimes people come up with things that I haven't thought of that we want to talk about. So I will usually start off the class with some background information that is given more like I'm talking to you now, like in a sort of lecture, informal lecture format. And then from there, we will start to move into discussion, reactions, and may or may not talk about other films. It really depends, again, on the class in front of me. Every class I teach is somewhat different. Even if we're talking about the same film that, one time, and then like 8 months later I talk about the same film again with another group of people. Based on that group of people, things will change. And I prefer to teach these classes not as a pre-recorded thing that you watch and you you don't interact with, that you just watch and take notes from. But I want these to be interactive in the sense that you are a person sitting in a class. It would be very similar to if you were taking a college course with me, as I'm a retired professor. But when I did teach a whole course on Guillermo del Toro, and I had a group of students, and we went over all these films in the order that they were released. And so it's very similar to that format, okay? I think the only difference is that in a college course, sometimes we watched the films together. And just for copyright and licensing reasons, I cannot do that. I can't stream films to people because this is not connected to a college or university. College or universities professors can often show material that is copyrighted because it's being done for nonprofit, and it falls under fair use and copyright guidelines. But when someone is teaching about the material, for instance, I can't, advertise with a film poster as my advertisement, okay, because I'm doing this for profit. This is my job. In any sense, that's why I ask students ahead of time to go ahead and watch the movies on their own. And then you come into class, and we go from there. And as I said, you could take 1 class, 2 classes, you could take 5 classes. It's totally up to you. And I just ask that you let me know which classes you want to be at in the note, or send me an email. If you take 4 to 7 classes, you will get 1 class for free. If you take 1 class and you need to think about it before you come back to another one, or you can't come to the next one, that's fine. They don't have to be in order or anything like that. They don't have to be consecutive. But I keep track of that information. So if you take 4 to 7 classes, you will get 1 class for free. And if you were to take 8 classes, you would get the final 2 classes for free because there are 10 in the series. And 9 of the films are films that Guillermo del Toro has written and directed. And one of the films he did not direct, but he had a very large presence with the writing and the production of that film. So he has some other films that are coming soon. Pinocchio is the one, I guess, closest to coming out, as far as I know. And that was supposed to come out this year, and now I have just read that they've moved it possibly to 2022. So we may be waiting a little bit for a brand new film. So while we wait, let's talk about these other ones. So I want to give a background to Del Toro, because what we did in the first class is I gave this background, and then we got into Kronos, the actual film. And what I found was that this background ate up a lot of time, and that took away from being able to have maybe as much discussion as we wanted to have. And every new group that comes in, because I'll have different people coming to take these classes for different films, I feel like I need to give this background, and I don't want people to have to sit through it 2 or 3 times. Okay, so I decided that I would give this part for free on my website and on YouTube so that people could have a listen to it. So my intention, again, is if you're thinking about taking the class, to go ahead and watch this and see if this piques your interest. And if you are already signed up to take a class, you've already paid for it, definitely listen to this intro to Del Toro before you end up taking a class with me, because I think it will inform your watching of the film to prep for class, because the only prep you have to do is to just watch the movie. I'm not asking for anything more than that, but some of the students from the last class mentioned that if they had known some of the things that I bring up in this intro to Del Toro himself, they might have actually thought a little bit differently in certain ways about the film. They might have seen some things that they might not have otherwise seen. Okay, so just to give some background on Del Toro, I begin with giving some information from an essay called Ode to a Master by James Cameron. So as you know, James Cameron is a filmmaker and close friend of Del Toro's. He references Guillermo del Toro's notebooks, and the notebooks, you'll hear me talk about them a lot in the classes, because there's so much that we get out of his notebooks. So what his notebooks are is that they're literally notebooks. They're nothing really that fancy. I don't get the impression that they are remarkably expensive or anything like that, but they are part of his writing process and his thinking process. And he gets a notebook, just a fairly simple, usually unlined notebook, often with a leather or suede cover, and he takes notes in that, and he has one devoted to each one of his films. And so he starts from there, and I guess from what I've read, he has notebooks that really predate films by, it could be years, because first of all, he's got notebooks that mention films that have never been made because a studio has never given enough interest to take that on, has given him the green light to go ahead and film. So certainly they are early concepts of things that he wants to work on. But they are likened by James Cameron to the codices of Da Vinci. He says that Del Toro's work cannot be compared to others. Absolutely incomparable. The notebooks are an integral part of the planning, the ritual, the imagery, the themes, and the meaning of his films. So his notebooks, if you're curious about, how can you see the notebooks, you can see quite a lot of the pages of the notebooks in this book here. This is one of those big coffee table books that's rather expensive. I remember I bought mine drastically on sale when I got it. But I've seen this book go for $60, $75. This is a pretty hefty book. It is fully illustrated, and it's called Guillermo del Toro Cabinet of Curiosities, My Notebooks, Collections, and Other Obsessions. And you can even see from the cover some of this imagery here. This is directly out of his notebooks, and some in the below part as well. So he's a very talented artist. I don't know if he considers himself very talented as an artist, but I think he is. And he puts a lot of detail into his work. He does a lot with colored pencils, with pen and ink. And he often draws concept art, things, here's some pictures from the back, things that will relate to his films. Of course, this is that's a photograph, actually, of him and the character from Pan's Labyrinth, the faun. But the rest on that page are all pages from his notebooks. And you can see the handwriting. It's all handwritten. Most of it is in Spanish. In this book, when there are pages that are reproduced in full from the notebook, if the writing in it is in Spanish, the translation in English is in the margins, which is nice and convenient. But this book categorizes by the film for the films that were out at the time this book came out. So, for instance, The Shape of Water does not appear in this text because it wasn't put together by that point. But this book also has some really great essays in it by different people. Cameron is one of them. And, just essays about his genius, his greatness. There are lots and lots of interviews in it as well with Del Toro himself. Luckily, he's one of those writers, filmmakers, who is very open about his process. He does not hold back when he's doing, say, a commentary track on a film. He talks the whole time, and he gives so much information about why he did this and why he did that and what he was thinking and what this is supposed to be a symbol of and so on. It doesn't mean that it leaves it so there's nothing left for us to interpret. I think there always is something for us to interpret. I think Philip Pullman said to me once that his job, his own personal job as the writer, was to write things, and my job as the critic was to tell him what he didn't know he was doing in the work. Tell him what symbols and things he was putting into that work that he didn't realize he was putting into it, for instance. He said that's the job of the critic. And so I love that definition, that idea that, a lot of writers enjoy when readers and audience members come up with interpretations that they had not thought of themselves. They're kind of like, wow. And someone just did this for me an hour ago as I was giving a reading of my work. It was a fairy tale, and someone in the chat made a comment about one of my characters. Does this character represent such and such? And instantly I thought, that was not in my head at the time, but that's fantastic. That is a fantastic reading. And darn it, I wish I had thought of that myself and put that in the story. And no, I'm not going to go back and change the story. I'm grateful to that person for having pointed that out to me. That means that what I wrote speaks to someone on a different frequency somewhat, which is wonderful. So, the thing with Del Toro is that his work does speak on a lot of different levels, and he gives quite a big background in his own notebooks about what he was doing or plans to do and so on. But then we can contribute to that as well. So, as Cameron is saying, the notebooks are really important. Now, the ironic thing about that is that Cameron actually is responsible for having lost one of Del Toro's notebooks. He lost the notebook for Kronos years ago because he was getting to know Del Toro, and he offered to take him out to dinner. And at the time, Del Toro was living on almost nothing. And he was fascinated by, oh my God, it's James Cameron, And he went out to dinner with him, and Cameron said, order anything off the menu. Order as much as you like, whatever you want to drink, whatever you want to eat. So Del Toro made it a point to really, really order quite a lot of food and good wine and so on. And they had apparently a really wonderful dinner and time together. And as a way of thanking him, Del Toro gave James Cameron the Kronos Notebook. I think he probably figured that this was something that he didn't have much to give, but this was an important thing that he could give. And so he gave this to him, and Cameron accepted it gratefully, and then somehow lost it in his home. And according to the last thing I read about this, it's still lost in, like, Cameron apparently lives in the same home, and I can imagine it's giant. And so maybe it's still there somewhere, let's hope it is. But that is the one notebook that, that no one's got access to. From what I understand, Del Toro planned to, or may have already done so, to will the notebooks to his daughter upon his death. So they will be in good hands. Cameron says of Del Toro that he writes and directs stories that deal with our darkest places. And he faces that darkness, taking whatever it is that we fear or avoid or suppress, and he uses that world as his canvas. This is a great quote from Cameron about Del Toro. He is the Santa Claus of the subconscious, the court jester of the id. He is our guide through the labyrinth of our worst nightmares. End quote. So Cameron says that Del Toro is one of those people who can help us confront our own mortality or others' mortality. That he focuses on the beauty and horror of life. His notebooks, he says, are maps to his mind, his art, and to the subconscious. It is through these books and his desire to talk about his work that we come to know him and his works of art. And then he says, if he didn't exist, we would have to invent him. But how do you invent the impossible? So it's interesting to see in Cameron's essay how much of a fan he had become at the time of the writing of Del Toro's work, when once things were the other way around. So the next little section of this book that I want to briefly go through is an actual essay about Del Toro himself and some of the things, not from the perspective, that is, of a fan of his work, a fellow director, but just from a basic biographical background of him. But I've teased out the kinds of things that I think matter to someone who is watching his films either for the 10th time or for the first time. It's interesting to note some of these background things about him, to see that his whole journey as a writer and director began so early for him. And I'm fascinated by that. I'm fascinated that he essentially goes back to his childhood so many ways in creating these works of art. So again, from this book, I am adapting some of this information, but he was born in Guadalajara, Mexico on October 9th, 1964. He describes himself as very thin, very pale, blue-eyed, and a strange kid, often called a wimp. I thought it was interesting that he said that he grew up surrounded by boys who looked very different from him, that they were dark-complected with dark hair and devastatingly good looks. And he notably creates many of his villains to be good-looking men. This is part of that disjointedness, the subversiveness that you see in his films. When you see the next film we're going to do is The Devil's Backbone, for instance, and you see this man walk on screen, and he's terribly good-looking, and he's got dark skin and dark hair, and he's very suave, and you think, good or evil? Not sure, right? And I always thought that was interesting about Del Toro in general, that, like any writer, are we exercising some of our childhood memories or fears or issues when we write something? So yes, he said that his childhood was kind of difficult because he looked physically so different. But he had a really formative experience when he was just 4 years old. So his father was a self-made man. He was a businessman, but he thought of himself that he wasn't really educated, like he wasn't a well-read man. So he won the lottery when Del Toro was just 4. And his father then bought a library full of books for their home. So this included a series of classic literature for children. So these were books like Huck Finn and then Hunchback of Notre Dame, etc. He also bought a set of medical encyclopedias, and then a collection of art books that was 10 volumes. And that collection spanned art, like it was a chronological history of artworks. So essentially what this meant was that Del Toro himself decided to just devour this library. And he notes that he became a hypochondriac immersed in art history because he had these medical encyclopedias to look at that had tons of diagrams. And imagine to a kid, a lot of those diagrams would be pretty creepy. And he obsessed over them to the point where he was convinced that he had all manner of things wrong with him. So I think that's kind of amusing because we will say to one another today, when you don't feel well, oh God, don't go online and start looking up the medical websites, because if you do, you're going to think you're suffering from all kinds of things, and we say that as if that wasn't a possibility in the past. Oh, the internet, it's bad because it gives us the ability to just look up an illness just like that. Guess what? So did books and encyclopedias back in the day. And so he became a complete hypochondriac. But he also was immersed in art history, and he especially liked art from like the time of the Cubist painters. And some of this really interesting, abstract, surreal art, of course, was very formative. So when you mix that with these really complex anatomical diagrams, you can imagine why it is then that this material would have made him kind of artistic in the way that he was artistic. So at the same time, he also started to read comic books, especially horror comics, its own genre. And the first book he bought was at age 7, called Best Horror Stories, edited by Forrest J. Ackerman. So from then until his 20s, he aimed to read a book every 1 to 2 days, which I think is fascinating and wonderful. So admirable. And he started to draw with colored pencils. So 3 of his early drawing obsessions were The Creature from the Black Lagoon, Frankenstein's Monster, and Lon Chaney's Phantom of the Opera. He and his brother also sculpted figures from clay, filled them with ketchup, and threw them from the roof of their home. So he did this like just to see them splatter, okay? He refers to himself then as artistic but morbid. So I think some of these things are really interesting about his childhood. And later, once he was an established filmmaker, he spoke at a film school in Hollywood. And he offered a bit of advice to the students there based on his own childhood interests. He said, quote, "Go have a life. Live. Get laid. Get into a bar fight. Get knifed in the fucking thorax." Excuse my language, that was his term. "Lose all your money. Make all your money back. Jump into a train." End quote. So he notes that as a kid, he both observed but also lived. He and his brother broke into abandoned houses. They walked through the city's sewer system in its entirety. Guadalajara's sewer system? Imagine, and then this comes up later. You take a film like Blade 2, there's an extensive scene in the city sewer system in that film. So there are ways that we can see a lot of these childhood interests and the way that he lived as a child come back in the subjects of his films. So this all led to, by age 8, he actually started making his own short films. And then just interested in art and reading and drawing and all sorts of things that he could do as a kid, And this went on and on up until he was 20, at which point he was apprenticed to the filmmaker Jaime Humberto Hermosillo, who gave him the advice, if a road is not presented, you build one, which I think is a really wonderful phrase that applies to so many things. So inspiring. So fear runs through his films. They can be called dark fantasy or fear-tinged fantasy. But unlike other writers and directors who present ways to cut ourselves off from our fears, he wants to combine facing fear with real life. He doesn't feel fantasy helps us escape, but it helps us to, quote, decipher reality, end quote. So what are his own fears? I find it interesting that his fears are spiritual and physical blindness. But another fear is success. He believes that failure actually lights his drive to do better. Success makes him complacent. So he quoted, he gave this quote once, which I like: when you're young and unsuccessful, you don't have the money. And if you're not careful, when you're old and successful, you don't have the passion. So both extremes, he believes, are tragedies to him that he's constantly trying to overcome. So much of his work is about a connection with his own childhood self, or his inner child, whatever you want to call it. It's about what would make his childhood self happy, excited, intrigued, even self-indulgent. So my contention is that he aims to enable us to connect with our inner selves and also to become friends with the dark. And as Cameron says, he is someone who does such a good job at being a guide to us as we confront our own fears of the darkness. So with that, I end my introduction to Del Toro, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you listen to this and you have any questions about him, you can certainly ask at any of the classes that you take. Just keep a note of them for later so that when I open things up to questions, you can let me know, and I'll do my best to answer you. And I hope that gives you something to think about if you are taking a class and you're going to be watching a film. Think about some of those things as you watch a film. Think about, what am I seeing in here that might make Del Toro's childhood self be intrigued or happy or delighted? What might make his childhood self sit here and laugh hysterically? Because sometimes it's about that. It honestly is. And those might be moments that, speak to some of us as well. We notice that sometimes even in his darker films, that there are moments of levity. There are moments that kind of break that darkness up and something somewhat amusing happens. Is that there because the atmosphere is getting very heavy, and he wants us to step back and say, it's okay, everything's okay, it's not that heavy, okay? And it's also a way to think about, some of his early influences, and how is it that growing up immersed in classic literature and medical encyclopedias and art books, how do you see these things manifesting in his films? Does having an exposure to the world of art mean that he's got this eye for color palettes? I would say that he does. I think all of his films work with color palettes. He would tell you that they do, that he has specific ones and what they mean. But I always think it's interesting when we add to that our own ideas about what we think those colors mean in that context, or what we think certain symbols mean in that context. So, like I said, this is a taste of, my style for how I talk with groups of people. It's pretty laid back. I bring my prepared material to it, and I have somewhat of a script, but on the other hand, as people start to discuss things, I really want to give people a vehicle to talk about how they feel about a film, about what they see in it, to get feedback from other people, and also to just kind of feel like you're in a group of people who understand your interests and who are like-minded. Especially now that we're probably going back into another lockdown, We have to think about ways that we can still stay connected to other people. We have to think about ways that we can keep our minds active and interested. And this is a way to do it, is to participate in classes with others. And think of it again, you're getting this college level instruction without the need to enroll in college, without the need to pay the money for college, and without the commitment of doing things like having to write papers and having to be graded. That might be the biggest freedom of all, is being able to listen and to discuss and to talk about things that are really interesting, college level material. And you don't have to have been someone who ever went to college or not. It really doesn't matter. I work with people of all skill levels and backgrounds. And, but to talk about these kinds of things, to remain connected, and to feel like we are engaging with film in this case. And I will be coming up with other, kind of build your own courses, or build your own class, that is, with like fairy tales and perhaps other films. I was thinking about doing something about films that talk about the nature of reality, kind of the mind-bending type of films, but also with fairy tales, which is another one of my interests as a scholar and areas in which I'm published. Maybe some things with goddess archetypes. The list is endless in my head of directions I can go. Creative writing is another one. I love to hold creative writing workshops as well, and they can be interactive, and we can do some writing, and I can do some assessment of writing without grades, right on the spot with people. I'm very glad to do that, because my original background was in tutoring, and I have a lot of experience with listening to people and giving an immediate reading of them and through the work. Okay, so if you're interested, if you just want to reach out, you can do that on my website. And my email address is susanreddingtonbobby@professorofwords.com. It's all lowercase. And I hope to hear from you, and I hope to see lots of you in my class. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.